Welcome back. In the last session, we introduced John's Gospel and started getting into a little bit deeper into the life of Jesus. And I'm going to backtrack to the beginning of John's Gospel because there was a story that I kind of glossed over in a different context. And that's Jesus' first miracle. The first miracle that he performed in public was at a wedding in Cana. And we talked about John sort of retelling the story of Genesis. But now I want to go back and take a look at this. So there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. The mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. Right now, the chronology of the Bible is really hard to pinpoint. So just a quick word about that. Luke was writing to a person named Theophilus, and Luke says basically, I've set out to create an orderly account for you of all the things Jesus said and did. And in doing that, Luke is the one that I kind of trust the most as far as a chronology. But keep in mind, an orderly account doesn't necessarily mean a chronological account. And so Luke's goal wasn't to give us a history book type listing of all the things Jesus did in order. It's just to tell us something about who Jesus is. And that's true of all the gospel writers. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of them take some artistic liberties. They use different literary forms in their writing to try to get their points across. They have different goals and different ways they achieve those goals. And so John, for example, I mentioned in the last session, John mentions Jesus going into the temple and overthrowing the tables, but he puts it right at the very beginning of the ministry of Jesus. And we talked about why he did that, right? So he's not setting out to tell us when things happened or scientifically or historically how things happened necessarily. He's making a point about Jesus, and he's saying Jesus is the fulfillment of the whole Hebrew Bible. And that's really the point that he's making. So here we get to the wedding. Now, when was all this? Well, John tells us it was his first public miracle. And so it would have happened, this whole wedding thing would have happened very early on in the ministry of Jesus. Did he have disciples yet? Or is John just calling them the disciples because that's how we all know them? Right? And I don't know. I do know that most of the people that Jesus calls to be his disciples, especially the apostles, he called them later on, after this whole event. So either way, he's there with his mom, with his friends, and I'm just going to, for now, call him his friends, rather than get into theological debates about what John is trying to say there. All right, but there they are at this wedding. The people ran out of wine. And this is a culture, two things that are really important to know here. First, it's an honor and shame culture. And if shame comes on you or your family, that's like the worst thing that can happen to you in many ways. And depending on the degree of shame and the thing that caused the shame, it could be even catastrophic to you. And the other thing is this culture centers on hospitality. If you have a guest, you lavish that guest with anything the guest could possibly imagine. They shouldn't have to ask for anything ever because you're on top of it. If you can't afford it, you do it anyway. You find a way. And if you're throwing a wedding, how much more so? Right, you're celebrating the joining of two families together. And it's not just the man and the woman, it's the two families coming together as one. And it's a huge celebration, a huge deal. You don't run out of wine at that. And these people, they knew how to party. They were not skimpy on their wine. And you would think that they'd have this overabundance of wine, and for some reason they didn't here. So the couple ran out of wine, and the mother of Jesus, Mary, came to Jesus saying they have no wine. So evidently, somebody, maybe one of the servants, we're not sure who, somebody came to Mary and said, help us, we have no wine. Well, Mary goes to Jesus saying they have no wine. Jesus said to her, woman, what does this have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. What does this have to do with us? Some translations say with me, it's the translation I'm using here says us, and it seems to be the inaccurate translation. So in other words, for some reason they went to Mary, and Mary came to Jesus at their request, and Jesus is saying, why? What does this have to do with us? But then he adds, my hour has not yet come. And that's a huge deal right there. So it's not just they're randomly asking for help, and Jesus said, it's not my problem, it's not that. There's something bigger going on. What does it mean, my hour has not yet come? And with Jesus, is talking to there, what Jesus is saying there is, I have not yet taken my throne. My hour of glory has not yet come. And there's something else you need to know about the Hebrew Bible here. All right, so when you go through the chronology of the kings, in the north, the nation of Israel, the king would have a queen. And the king would very, very often have many wives, but one of those wives would be the queen and have the responsibilities of the queen. But in Judah, in the south, and this is David's kingdom, starting with Solomon, as far as we can tell, they took a different approach. And so, if Solomon had 700 wives, that's, as Phil Vischer says in What's in the Bible, I guess it is, he says that's way more than he needed. So 700 wives, he's going to have a whole lot of kids. But how do you keep 700 wives from just being jealous of each other, backstabbing each other, all trying to get into this political maneuvering to be the queen? And one of the approaches they took is to do something that some nations did, which is instead of a queen, like your wife is the queen, instead of that, your mother becomes the queen. And it's a position that in English is called the queen mother. So when you see that phrase in English in the Bible, it's a Hebrew word called gabira. So the gabira is the queen mother. And that position was held all through the kings. And there's only one time where there was a king who did not have a gabira, and that's the horrible, wicked woman Athaliah, the daughter of Jezebel. Athaliah killed her own children and took the throne to become king. So when she first got there, she first intermarried with the people from Judah. She said, no, we're not doing that queen mother thing. I'm the queen. Deal with it. And then when that king died and her son became king, she said, oh, it was so wrong of me to do that. Your father had such a beautiful tradition. It was this thing called the Gabira. And we're going to reinstate that. I'm now the queen again. I'm the queen mother, the Gabira. And that was the only time that there's no mention of the king's mother. All the other kings of Judah, you get this pattern. So-and-so became king. He reigned this many years. Here are the things he did. His mother's name was something. It always mentions the mother's name because that mother would be the Gabira. Well, fast forward to Jesus. You have Mary, poor woman from Nazareth, with a reputation of adultery in her past. And these people are going to her saying, we ran out of wine, please help us. It makes no sense that they would go to her, except that they've heard all the rumors and stories about Jesus. And they've concluded, based on these stories that they've heard, they've concluded Jesus must be Messiah. And Messiah is the king in the line of David, who's going to overthrow Rome and do all these great things. Therefore, Mary is the Gabira. If Jesus is our king, Mary is the queen mother. So they go to Mary for help because they believe that Jesus is their Messiah. Asking Mary for help was a profession of faith that Jesus is Messiah. And that's why Jesus would say, what does this have to do with us? Right? My hour has not yet come. I'm not yet the glorified king. Yes, I'm Messiah. I am the king who's come, but I'm not yet on the throne. I haven't taken my position of power yet, which means that Mary is not the Gabira yet. Well, after this, his mother said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. So she comes to Jesus and says, they have no wine. Jesus says, my hour has not yet come. What does this have to do with us? And I suspect that she gave Jesus that look that only mothers can give. And Jesus kind of shrugged his shoulders, went, whatever. And she just turned around. She didn't even ask again. She just turned around and said to the servants, whatever he says, do it. She goes away. And there were a bunch of water pots there, so Jesus took a look around. There were 6 of these water pots, and not like stovetop things. John's Gospel says that each of these could hold 20 to 30 gallons of water. So figure on average 25 gallons. And Jesus said, fill them. So 25 gallons each, possibly more. And there were 6 of them. That's 150 gallons, maybe more. And they filled them up with water, 150 gallons of water. And Jesus said, now take some out and give it to the head waiter. And the head waiter, who is a big deal, hotshot person at this the wedding thing, He tasted the water, and John said he defines it as the water which had become wine, and he didn't know where it came from. And he said, everybody serves the best wine first. The people show up, you want to impress them, you give them the best wine, and they start feeling good, then you put out the cheap stuff, and they're happy. It doesn't matter anymore. But you have saved the best wine for last. He's going on, I've never had wine like this. This is amazing. And this, John says, this beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, what does it mean that they believed in him? Because they still didn't quite know who he was yet. As far as they knew, he was a carpenter who just did something really amazing. And within this, they got a glimpse of people saying, we believe he's Messiah. And they're all kind of thinking, what is this? But they certainly believe that he's just not some ordinary person. Well, when you go over to, we'll flip over to Mark, back to Mark chapter 1, and we find out that after this wedding, Jesus went with some of his friends to the region of Galilee, around Capernaum. Capernaum is a small city at the top of the Sea of Galilee. It's in the region of Galilee, also called the Galilee. And Capernaum, it's a fishing village. There were definitely a lot of fishermen there. It was right near a really prime fishing spot on the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee itself is really more of a lake than a sea, I guess. But I have some photos from Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee. My wife and I got to go to Israel in 2011 and had another opportunity to co-lead a trip with Pillar College with a colleague and friend, Dr. Keith Brewer. That was in 2014. And so these photos are from those two trips. You can see the synagogue here in Capernaum where Jesus would have been teaching. And at some point in history, I don't think it was too far after the time of Jesus, the synagogue was destroyed but then rebuilt again. And on the sides you can actually see the original stones, the original layers, and then the rebuilt layers. But either way, this is what the synagogue would have looked like. It's the exact location and everything. This is basically the synagogue that Jesus was teaching in. So he would have been up front there. He would have sat down to teach the people. And then the front door of the synagogue would be opposite. So if you stand at the door of the synagogue and look out, you would be looking right at the city of Capernaum. And that UFO thing over there, I don't know what architect designed that. Not my style personally, but I can't get past it looking like a UFO. But it's a church that was built as a shrine to sort of make Peter's house into a shrine. So that's where Peter lived with his mother-in-law and his family. And you could pick up if you have a baseball, you could stand in the synagogue. If you have a decent arm, you could throw it and hit Peter's house there. So when Jesus left the synagogue, he would have just made his way right over to Peter's house, and that's where everybody would have flocked. Here's some photos of the Sea of Galilee. So you can see, it's really not very far from one side to the other. Top to bottom, it's quite a bit farther, but there's an amateur archaeologist. There was a big drought in the Sea of Galilee, and this amateur archaeologist discovered a boat there that a whole big team of people came in, and they were able to get this boat up and preserve it. It's in a museum there on the Sea of Galilee now. It's called the Jesus boat. It's very unlikely Jesus was ever in that boat, but it's still called the Jesus boat. But it is dated to the time of Jesus, and now this whole region was a fishing community, and the fishermen probably all knew each other and stuff. So, I mean, technically speaking, it really is very possible that Jesus would have been in that boat at some point. So, no idea, but either way, it gives you an idea of the size of sort of a typical fishing boat, and that would have been similar to what Peter would have used when Jesus asked Peter to take him out in the boat. They were in the boat on and off throughout the Gospels, so that's what it looks like. So this just gives you an idea of what the region of Galilee is like. Very, very beautiful place, amazingly beautiful place. And here they are way up north in the city of Capernaum. It's a fishing village, and Peter lives there. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They're all fishermen. They live in this region. And Jesus goes up and he's in the synagogue. All right, so they came to the synagogue, and Jesus started teaching in the synagogue. And it was customary, if a guest rabbi comes into the synagogue, very often the main rabbi at the synagogue will invite this guest to speak there. It was very common practice. So here's Jesus. He has been starting to teach here and there, and he goes into the synagogue. They let him teach. And now imagine this. You're there listening to his teaching, right? Mark tells us they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, not as the scribes. What does that mean? Well, usually rabbis, and the scribes apparently as well, different teachers of the Hebrew Bible, they would learn from other rabbis, like we said earlier. And so if you're a student of this rabbi, then pretty much whatever that rabbi teaches, you teach. And as you're teaching, you would read some scripture and talk about the scripture and say there are several views of that, and this rabbi over here says this, and this rabbi says this, but I say this, or my rabbi says this. And that's really how you would teach. You give people lots of options, and here's what I believe, and here's why I believe it, here's why you should believe it. Jesus just stood up and said, yeah, you've heard this stuff, but I tell you this. Right? It doesn't matter what the other rabbis say. Here's what I say. And that was pretty shocking for some people. So they were amazed at his teaching, and there was a man there in the synagogue with an unclean spirit, a demon. And he cried out. He probably refers to the demon. I'm not sure whether Mark was talking about the man or the demon. But either way, the demon's words are coming out here. And this demon, in the middle of Jesus' teaching, so imagine you're sitting there listening to Jesus' teaching. You're amazed because you haven't heard somebody teach like this. And right in the middle of it, this crazy guy, demon-possessed guy, cries out here, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And he said it very stern, and be quiet. From what I've been taught, now I know not much at all about Greek, so I can't confirm this, but I have been told by several different sources that when Jesus said be quiet, the words in Greek, the phrasing in Greek, is extremely strict and harsh. And Jesus says this a few times throughout the Gospels. This is one of them. And it could, if my sources are right here, it could be very accurately translated. Jesus just looked right at the demon and said, "Shut up and come out of him." And I love that. The demon threw the guy into convulsions, and then the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. So there's this guy starts convulsing and then shrieks, and this demon comes out. The guy collapses on the floor, and people rush over and help him up, and there he is in his right mind for the first time in who knows how long. And they were all amazed. So I'm sure they were. Right, this doesn't happen at an everyday church service, right? At least not at the churches I go to. They were amazed. They debated among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He even commands the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And immediately the news spread everywhere. So the synagogue service ends, and the people are leaving, and they don't rush right home, right? They're all just standing around. Did you see that? Did you see the look on the guy's face? And wow, did you hear that shriek? That was so creepy. And everybody's talking about it. And as they dispersed through the city to their homes, and it wasn't a huge city, but, relatively well populated for the region at the time. And everybody's talking about this. Well, in this culture, again, it's a culture of hospitality. And Peter invites Jesus over for dinner. And they knew each other already. They were at the wedding together. They were friends. And so Jesus goes with Peter to Peter's house for dinner. Well, where do half of the other people from the synagogue go? Anybody who didn't go home is following Jesus just to see if he's going to do anything else. Well, they get to Peter's house, and Peter yells in the door, "Hey, where's dinner? Supper ready? And why don't I smell anything? Where's my dinner?" It was customary that the woman would be preparing everything at the house. Well, Peter, who's called Simon at this point, Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever. What I've been taught is that in the Bible, when somebody has a fever, it's not like a cold. She doesn't just have a bad cold. It's probably something very serious. Malaria, I think, is one of the things that I've been told this can be. But it's something, really, really serious for her. They tell Jesus. Jesus goes inside the house, just kind of walks over and very gently says, "Oh, it's so good to see you. Come here, let me help you sit up." And as he sits her up, he heals her. And by the time she's sitting upright, she feels great, and she's like, "Oh, this is wonderful. I feel great. Let me go make you some supper." And she runs off into the kitchen and starts making food. Well, the crowds are still right outside the door. Out comes Jesus to the crowds, and, what happened? You should have seen it. He healed her just like that, and, she's up making supper, and, word spreads really quickly. So Jesus would have spent, pretty much the whole night then. Just everybody kept bringing anyone who was sick or anybody who they thought might have a demon or anything like that. So then, at some point, I'm going to flip back to Luke, to chapter 5. Jesus is teaching, and he's teaching right up near Capernaum again. And let's see, where are we? All right, so the crowd, there was a big crowd forming, and the longer Jesus was teaching, the bigger the crowds got. And as the crowds gathered around more and more, Jesus was right up on, face to face with them practically. And the more crowded it gets, the harder it is to teach. You're trying to keep eye contact with people, and they're surrounding you now. You got to really project because it's hard to hear, and depending on exactly where they were, the sound may or may not have been that good depending on what was behind them. So if Jesus is down on the stone there, or dirt rather, if he's down by the sand, or if there's any grass, any sound waves would just kind of get dissolved into it. So it would be really hard to teach, right? Hard to keep everybody engaged. Peter's there, and Peter and his brother and James and John, they had their boats out as well. They're all fishermen, so they had their boats out. They were fishing all night. They didn't catch anything all night. It was just not a good fishing night. And they're cleaning their nets, right? So they're just wrapping everything up. Cleaning the nets is not the most exciting part of fishing. You just want it done, and especially after a long night where you've caught nothing, and they're tired. They just want to get the nets washed, finish everything up, put it away, go to bed. Jesus says, "Peter, take me out a little ways in your boat, because I got all these people here. It'll help me to teach." So Peter goes out just a little bit, and one of the things that would happen here is it would be much easier for Jesus to engage the crowd from back just a little bit. He doesn't want to be far away from them, but he wants to be able to make eye contact with everybody. But the other thing that happens is the sound waves now can reflect off the surface of the water back at the people, and it'll help the acoustics a bit. So both of those things are happening. And Jesus keeps teaching and finishes up, and the people stand up, and they're starting to wander around, and they're talking. Some are going home, some are just hanging out with each other. And Jesus turns to Peter. He says, "Peter, take me out just a little bit deeper." Peter says, "All right, sure." So they go out, and they're just in somewhat deeper water, not real far from land, but far enough. And Jesus says, "All right, throw the nets in. Let's see if we can catch anything." And Peter says, he just looks at Jesus and smiles. He says, "Jesus, you are a great teacher. And those miracles you did, healing people and all that stuff, that was amazing. But look, I'm the fisherman, right? I can tell you're close to God. Maybe you're even a prophet, great teacher, but I'm the fisherman. Trust me, there are no fish here." And, Jesus kind of like, "Oh, come on, just toss them in once, see what happens." And Peter's saying, "If I toss the net in once, then I'm going to have to clean the whole thing. I'm going to have to clean it again. We just got done with this. I just want to go to sleep. Jesus, please, just let it go. I'll take you fishing some other time, but not now. I was fishing all night. The fish are out at night. They're not here during the day. Just no." And Jesus gives him this look. And Peter says, "Fine. Because you are asking me, I'll do this. I wouldn't do this for anybody else, just you." Now, why would Peter do that? At this point, he doesn't quite know who Jesus is. He knows that he's done miracles. He's starting to be pretty fascinated with the guy. They've been friends a while, but there's no reason yet for Peter to put the nets in and have to re-clean them and clean up the water out of the boats and all this stuff again. He wouldn't do it, except what happened recently, right? Jesus went in and healed Peter's mother-in-law. And Peter now says, if anybody else asked me, I wouldn't do it. But Jesus, since it's you asking me, I'll do this for you, right? You healed my mother-in-law, I owe you. And he reluctantly takes the nets, throws them in the water, starts pulling it up, and he starts to say, Jesus, see, Jesus, there's just... And all of a sudden, he realizes this net's really heavy, and he starts pulling and pulling, and he can't get the nets into the boat, right? As they're trying to get the nets up, the boat starts to take on water, and he calls for the other guys, partner business, and they bring their boats out, and between the two of them, they're trying to get all the fish up in the boat, and Jesus is just sitting down on the side of the boat laughing at this point. And Peter... he kind of glances up and sees Jesus just sitting there relaxing with a smile on his face. Peter realizes that I don't know who this man is, but he shouldn't be around me. He falls on his knees in front of Jesus and says, Master, depart from me. I am a sinful man. Right? He didn't want Jesus to leave, but he's like, whoever you are, I don't know who you are, but I am not worthy to be in your presence. And that's when Jesus said, Peter, you've been fishing for fish since you were a kid, right? Follow me, I'll make you fisher of men. And immediately Peter left everything and followed Jesus. Right? And that's, like, Mark skips over all those details, right? But there's this big relational thing going on. And the people who followed Jesus either had that type of relationship with him, or had heard so many stories that by the time they met Jesus and Jesus said, follow me, they're like, heck yeah, I'm in. And that, it's not this like, they're not like possessed by the Holy Spirit or something and just forced to do something just because Jesus said, do this. It was very, very relational. So Peter and his buddies, they pull all these fish onto the land. And when they look at a big, massive pile of fish like this, nice fresh fish right from the sea, they don't see fish, they see money, because that's their business. And so they're looking at all of these fish, and if it were me, to be quite honest, I'd be thinking, wow, Jesus is a great teacher, but if we can pull him into our fishing business, imagine how much money we'll be making. And thankfully the other guys there didn't think that way. They just said, we have all this money here, and you know what? It doesn't matter anymore. We're following Jesus. I'm leaving all of this behind. We're following Jesus. And now that's the response Jesus wants, but it's also the response that when you really got to know Jesus, you wanted nothing more than to drop everything and follow him. He was just that kind of person. In the next session, we'll start to see Jesus really engaging the community, engaging the people, and making some enemies pretty much right away as he does it.